Thank you very much for listening to this recording of the webinar that I conducted on the 8th of February 2011. I must apologise in advance for a couple of false starts due to some technological challenges that we've been having, but I can assure you that this presentation should play correctly, and certainly got heaps of great information to share with you over the next hour, so thank you very much for listening. You can actually use some of the controls on the bottom of the player. On the right hand side there's a button to watch the presentation in full screen mode, and on the left hand side some controls to skip slides or go back and listen to a slide again. So thanks again for listening. Before we get started into the content, I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to talk about who I am, and what we do, and why I've come here today to sort of share this information with you, and why this information is important. Hopefully you kind of know that already, otherwise you wouldn't be listening, but just to, I guess, reinforce it. I started Pro Solution Private Clients back in 2002, and very quickly I realised that investors, there was a huge sort of chasm of lack of information on structuring property, and there's a lot of sort of tax-based information, but what it lacked was the loan structuring, so the finance side of things, and also some of the financial planning considerations. And so I noticed this, and I started writing some articles for Australian Property Investor. It was the only magazine around at that time. And I got some really overwhelming response, and so that's just sort of, I guess, encouraged me to continue writing more and more articles, and subsequently published a few books. So my passion is really around, I guess, sharing that information and knowing that it's often appreciated, and that people really want it. So just trying to get as much information out there as possible. Maybe the information isn't perfectly relevant to every single person's situation, but if nothing else, if all it does is just sort of create some thought and get you thinking more strategically about things, or hopefully prepare for events before they happen and those sorts of things, I'm pretty happy. I guess the lack of information probably stems from the problems or strengths and weaknesses of different advisors in the industry. So accountants, and a lot of people go off to their accountant to get advice around property, but accountants tend to be very tax focused, and that's not surprising. They're tax sort of accounting people, but interestingly enough, there are competing priorities often that compete in addition to tax benefits that need to be considered. I'm not saying that they'll win every time, but you've got to give some consideration. Bankers aren't necessarily, so if you go off to your bank to go and get some loan structure advice, bankers aren't necessarily going to know a lot about that as well. And even as recent as this week, we had a private banker in Martin Place, Sydney, dealing with a very high net worth client of ours, suggesting that he consolidate all his tax deductible loans, roll them all into one loan, don't worry about the purpose, because it's just a little bit neater, and it's crazy. Clearly a lack of knowledge there, even at a private banking platform. And lastly, financial planners aren't necessarily going to know a lot about property and loan structuring unless they've got specific experience in there. But traditionally planners tend to be focused on sort of selling managed funds and so forth. A little bit about me and my background. As I said, I started this business 9 years ago, so have been working with property investors day in, day out over that period of time. But my background is in chartered accounting, so I used to work for two of the big four accounting firms in Deloitte and KPMG, and I'm also a qualified financial planner and qualified mortgage broker. So I come with that sort of background of accounting, tax, financial planning and finance, and I think it provides a good holistic background, and it's backed up by formal qualifications. So I certainly spent too much time studying and writing books over my life, I think. So a little bit about me. Let's talk about kind of my philosophy, because I think that's important too. Okay, so in simple terms, my philosophy around structuring, investing, and really anything financial is to try and keep it as simple as possible. Simple is often easy to understand, it's clear, it's often lower risk and often a lower cost. So what we try and do when we work with clients is trying to simplify everything as much as possible. Now there's some things that are inherently complex, and in fact by simplifying you take additional risks. So you can't do it with everything. But what you don't want to do is sort of overthink a situation. And I think a really good example of that would be employees, PAYG employees, investing through hybrid discretionary trusts or other sort of complex structures like that. For me, that it's not really going to provide much, if any, tax benefits or any other financial planning benefits, and all it does is just create complexity for no real gain. So what I like to do is keep things as simple as possible, and a reason, or one of the reasons behind that, is that the financial services sector and advisors, not all but many, thrive on complexity. So that is, if they can create some complexity in your life, they then create a need for them to be there and to advise you. And a lot of financial products, and this is not really property based, but a lot of financial products are often made out to seem or to be more complex than they are, just to seem sexy and I guess you're sort of pushing the envelope and trying everything, but often they're laden in fees and self-interest, and they don't end up working out. And I think often the best strategies are the most simplest. If you think back, and you might have some elderly grandparents or uncles or relatives and so forth that might have built wealth through property. A lot of that older generation just stuck to the basic concept of buying land, and if I bought land in a good area, it'll appreciate one day. I'll have something to pass down to the kids, and so it wasn't necessarily totally driven by equity. But that's a simple strategy, and it worked really well for most people. So I like to keep things simple. So keep that in mind as I go through the presentation, because some of the things might initially seem complex, but they're not really once you kind of get your head around it, and I'm certainly not making it complex for any particular reason. There's only so much information I can share with you, however, over the next 60 minutes. So, but there's heaps of different strategies that for different people for different times and different scenarios. And I can only give you I'll touch on a few over the next 60 minutes. So at the end of the presentation, with your permission, what I'm going to do is outline a couple of resources, some books and so forth, that I think you need to read and digest, and some tools and calculators that will help you through your journey of building wealth, and to make sure you're optimising your structure and opportunities and saving as much tax along the way as well. And these 4 resources, I think, will really add a lot in terms of financial planning and the lending structure sorts of things, the things that I think are greatly missing in most people's strategies. So I'll talk about that at the end, very briefly, but just to let you know that's what I want to do. Okay, this is the last point I want to make before we jump into the content, into the structuring stuff. Why is this information important? Well, it's important because it's hard work to be a property investor. Often people find it hard work, and most of it's psychological. Some of it's finding the time to do it. Sometimes it's the fortitude or the guts to sort of take that first leap into property. And whether you've got a good structure or bad structure, it's going to take the same amount of time and energy in most circumstances. So you'll spend the same time researching to buy a property and to set up your structures and so forth. You'll have to borrow the same amount. The lending and risk associated with that will be the same. You'll use the same amount of equity and pay the same amount of costs and so forth. So really the difference between a great structure and a poor one isn't much. It's not going to cost you any extra time. It's certainly going to cost you any extra money. In fact, it'll save you money having the right structure. So really, I like to think that the structuring side of things, the financial planning and the finance, the loan structuring, is really the low-hanging fruit. It's the easy stuff that every investor should be able to pay attention to. Let me draw an analogy. It's the best analogy I could think of. But it's a little bit like an Olympic swimmer that trains and trains and trains and trains and really does a lot of hard work. And then they turn their attention to their equipment. So they start thinking about what bathing suit will they wear. And so if they go and do a little bit of research and speak to the right advisors and select the right bathing suit, they could shave off maybe, half a second off their personal best time just because they've got the right tools. They didn't have to work any harder to do that. They didn't have to train harder or change anything. They're just picking the right tools and implements. And so it's really about working smarter, not working harder. And if you get the loan structuring right, and if you get the financial planning considerations right, it's really what happens is you get extra return, extra after-tax return from your investments without any extra effort. So it's the simple stuff, as I said, that is easy to get right, and that's why it's really important for you to learn some of the tips I've got to share with you tonight. Okay, this is what I'd like to cover over the next hour or so. It's a mixture of sort of financial planning and credit advice stuff. So very much sort of focus on those two things as I've spoken about. The two mistakes I'm going to talk about at the end are probably what I think would be the most valuable, and so hopefully they make sense. But if you can get grasp of the concept of those two most common mistakes and avoid them and not do them, I can almost guarantee you'll be successful. So they're really important. If you've got any questions, I'll give you my personal email address at the end, and you can certainly ask any questions you might have after listening to this presentation. Look, just very quickly, I don't want to labour the point, but obviously the information in this presentation is just general information. It's not specific advice. And what you need to do is just make sure it's appropriate for your personal circumstances before going off and implementing it. I often meet people that might touch base with me maybe a couple of years after reading one of my articles and implementing some advice off the back of that article, and then we find out it was just inappropriate. So just be really careful about how you use it. It's correct, but what needs to be considered is whether it's suitable for your situation. Okay, let's look at the first lending strategy, and this one's a really powerful one. It's essentially the strategy is really around borrowing the maximum and using an interest-only offset account, and it's driven by two tax rules. Primarily, the first rule is the maximum tax-deductible loan you'll ever crystallise against an investment property is set in place or set in stone when you first purchase the property. So how much you borrow when you initially purchase the property is very important, because you'll have to live with that decision for the rest of the ownership period. In fact, the only way of changing the level of gearing against the property is changing its ownership, and that can be very, very expensive in terms of stamp duty and capital gains tax. So what you need to do is think about that very carefully before you do it. So if you go and buy a property, say for $500,000, and you go and borrow $300,000 to acquire that property, that's all you'll be able to do in the future in terms of the tax deductibility nature of that debt against that property. So you can't go back and increase that $300,000 loan and claim interest against that loan in respect to that property. Of course, you can access the equity to buy other property, but I'm just talking about that particular property. The second rule is once a loan is repaid, it's gone forever from a taxation perspective. So if you take that $300,000 loan and you put $100,000 in it, so you reduce the balance from $300,000 to $200,000, you can't go back and pull that money out again. It's now gone, you've reduced that loan amount, and now the maximum tax deductible loan ever once you own that property is $200,000. So my rule therefore is always borrow the maximum as much as you can against an investment property, never repay the loan balance, and instead put any cash that you might already have at the moment or accumulate over the life of owning the property into an offset. So you're preserving the original tax deductible nature of the debt, but you're saving interest. So you're not going to pay any more interest using this strategy, but it just preserves the tax deductible nature of the debt. So let's look at a case study, because I think we can really demonstrate this really well by looking at this. Jenny's just purchased her first investment property for $500,000. She's got about $200,000 of cash savings as a deposit. Her plan is to occupy the property for the next 5 years, but it will eventually be a long-term investment property. So let's have a look at how we would structure this lending. Okay, let's have a look at how we'd structure the loan for Jenny. What we'll do is borrow 525,000. This is what we want to do because that's the maximum we can borrow against this property, and that represents obviously the purchase price plus the costs, including stamp duty, legal fees, and those sorts of things. So we'll go off to the bank.